know, when you take a look back at the countdowns from my first year of countdown making, you start to notice a pattern, and no, that pattern isn't the fact that they're not very good. That pattern is that they're about boss battles. And honestly, what can I say? I love boss battles. They're a lot of fun and an important part in most games. So without any further ado, I present to you my top 15 favorite boss battles, with 3 rules. 1 per franchise, only games I've played, and the 3rd rule is no final bosses. If you're familiar with the countdown community, you already know why this is, and if not, I'll give you a hint. It's a countdown, and it's coming out in November. With all that said, let's begin. Citizens of Earth is a great game, but when it comes to the bosses, they're not really going to be memorable in terms of gameplay, as they kind of feel similar. However, when it comes to concept, they can be really memorable. Take this boss for instance. Throughout the game, there are these 4 robots that are causing trouble: Colonel Cookie, Agent Doom, the Dragon, and Honcho Villa, and you end up fighting all of them alongside some other enemy. However, they all run away before you can defeat them. But once you make it down to the bottom of the missing moonbucks, you find all 4 of them waiting at the end. And since they're all guarding something important, they all want to fight you.
We already kicked your robots once. What makes you think you stand a chance this time?
Together we are indomitable.
Well, lucky for us, I don't know what that word means.
They're all fused together. Each of their faces show up on the TV screen at some point, and they all use attacks that they used against you in previous fights. The actual fight with them from a gameplay standpoint isn't anything all that special, just like most of the bosses in this game, but the sheer idea is so awesome. In the legendary Starfy, there's a group of villains called the Terrible Team Trio, and honestly, they'd probably be a runner-up for my best villains list. Throughout the game, you fight each of them as a boss, and they're all pretty enjoyable. However, later in the game, they start to realize the true destruction of what they've been doing. They want to quit, but their boss is going to kill them if they do. The fight with them in the sunken ship's actually pretty interesting. On one hand, it's kind of a rehash of the other fights, but at the same time, there's one big difference from most boss rushes. You're fighting all 3 of them at the same time. However, as you make it through the sunken ship, they catch up to you again, because they know that if they go back without Bunston, they're pretty much going to die. So, in a last-ditch effort to beat you, they pull out their super secret special move, the Paper Cut Crusher. You have to then defend against the Paper Cut Crusher, which is essentially just a glorified game of rock, paper, scissors. However, it's not completely random. One of them's always going to give away their move by accident. Overall, this fight was pretty good story-wise, and I thought it was pretty interesting to see what would happen if 3 bosses you fought previously would try to beat you at the same time. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I like the Wonderful 101, but I don't like it as much as everyone else does. That mainly comes down to me not being that big a fan of beat-em-ups. And the fact of the matter is that thing about me liking it but not quite as much as everyone else transfers over to pretty much every gameplay aspect of the game to me, including the bosses. There was one boss fight that I really liked though, and that would be Giga Goojin. Basically, the boss fights in the Wonderful 101 have a lot of variety to them, and there are a few that actually take after Punch-Out, and Giga Goojin is the best one of those. As you guys know, I'm a pretty big fan of Punch-Out, so you would imagine I'd really take a liking to this boss. It's not just the gimmick I like though, I also like the sheer scale of it all. This fight just feels big, and considering it's the second to last boss in the game, that's not exactly a bad thing. The background's intense, the battlefield's big, and there are just a lot of crazy attacks that Giga Goojin uses. Heck, even at one point in the fight, he actually summons some more enemies to attack you. Overall, this fight's awesome, and it is a great way to lead up to the final boss of the game. Hey look, I'm talking about Psychonauts again. It's almost like it's one of my favorite games out there or something. Well, enough with the sarcasm and subconsciously hoping for a sequel. How about I talk about the fight? In Black Velvetopia, you help a man named Edgar build a tower of cards up to the sky to rescue a beautiful woman named Lampita. You also have to worry about the vicious bull El Odio. However, when you make it to the top, you don't find Edgar, just El Odio. The fight's pretty fun. You stun him with confusion grenades and then use telekinesis to throw spiked poles at him. Halfway through the fight, El Odio gets subdued and Dingo jumps in to finish the job, but it turns out that El Odio is actually Edgar. However, since this is in Edgar's mind, Raz tries to explain to him that there is no Dingo and there is no Lampita. It's just him reliving his botched high school romance. There also is no El Odio, and it's just a metaphor for Edgar's blind fury at this whole series of events. After all, El Odio does literally translate to the hatred. However, Dingo and Lampita get him all fired up again, and he turns into El Odio and you'll have to continue the fight. However, this time it's a bit different. This time you have to stun Dingo and take the poles out of El Odio's back and put them into his. Also, while you don't really have to worry about Dingo killing you, you do need to keep him from killing El Odio. So technically it's an escort mission, but it's actually really well done. It's not that cheap, as opposed to a later part of the game which will go unmentioned. After you kill Dingo, Edgar sees just how pathetic the both of them were. Upon hearing Lampita's excuses, you think Edgar's gonna go El Odio again, but instead he just opens up a pit, putting them out of his mind forever. Gameplay-wise, this was a fun boss fight, and it also just goes to show how good Psychonauts is at character development. You know, while Spongebob Battle for Bikini Bottom only had 3 bosses in it, they were all pretty good, so it's clear they went for quality over quantity there. My personal favorite, which isn't really saying much seeing as it had a total of 1 boss fight to compete with, is the fight with Robot Patrick. In the first phase of the fight, you play as Spongebob, and it's relatively easy. You just have to avoid his attacks, most of which you're out of range of, until he does his spin attack, in which you have to avoid it until he stops spinning. Once the fight ends, Robo Patrick falls down and you have to go over and spin attack his weak spot. After 3 hits of that, SpongeBob gets frozen by Robot Patrick and Sandy jumps into the ring. This is easily my favorite part of the fight, as Sandy's given a lot of mobility in the ring with both her glide and swinging off of all the hooks in the ring. You get hits onto Robot Patrick the same way you do in the last phase of the fight, however here it's a bit different. This time when you hit Robot Patrick, he'll jump up to the ceiling and pour some toxic sludge into the arena. Robo Patrick's attacks also get stronger in this phase of the fight. However, one thing is in your favor. There are a bunch of boxes that fall into the arena so you can step on them without getting hurt by the sludge. That way you're actually able to hit Robot Patrick. Once you hit him a 3rd time, he floods the entire arena and SpongeBob's back in the fight. And here we get to the most challenging part of the fight for several reasons. The first reason is the fact that, unlike in the first phase of the fight, Robot Patrick isn't guaranteed to stop his spin attack with his back facing you, so you have to predict which way he's going to be facing when he stops the attack. Also, since the arena's flooded, you have to hit him with the Bubble Bowl, which has a little bit of a charge-up time. And lastly, most of the arena's moving due to the conveyor belts that litter the whole place. I don't know what else to say. Robot Patrick is just a really awesome boss fight. With the wide selection of bosses that the Kirby series has, who would have thought that my personal favorite boss in the series would have come from one of the spin-off games? So what should I say about Squashini? Well, how about describing the fight? You see, his attacks are actually decided with a slot machine. Most people who have played Super Mario Sunshine might think this gimmick would be annoying, but it really works here. That's mainly because 3 out of 4 of Squashini's attacks you can counter. The first one, he launches a bunch of cards at you, and you have to pick them up off the floor and launch them back at him. The second attack is when he gets a curtain and pulls a bunch of bombs out from behind it, and you have to catch them before they hit the ground and throw them back at him. The third attack, and the only one that really bugs me, is when Squashini climbs inside of his hat and summons 2 more and has you play a little shell game to try to find which hat he's in. Now, it's not impossible to follow, but the problem is that it's not really clear from the beginning which hat he's in, at least not to me. I've never been able to figure it out. The last attack, and the only one you can't counter, is when Squashini ties you to a giant bomb and you have to get out of your ropes. However, once you do, it's not over yet. You can also keep ringing the bell on top to get beads, but you have to get away from the bomb before it blows. Now, there are two other options on the wheel that never get spun in battle. The first one summons Squashini, and the other, I'm assuming, would give you stars if it actually landed on it. Overall, Squashini was a really creative and fun boss fight, and if any of you out there want to fight a good slot machine themed boss, then this is one I'd recommend. You know, in a game with a ton of crazy and over-the-top fighters like Punch-Out, it would stand to reason that my personal favorite would be the most crazy and over-the-top of them all. Seriously though, Aran Ryan, both as a character and as a boss fight, is awesome. Now, the most important thing to know about Aran Ryan's fighting style in both versions of the fight with him is that, unlike the other fighters, you can't just dodge out of the way and then punch him. What you have to do is punch him before his attack hits you just at the right moment. Keep in mind, you can do this with other fighters, but it's a pretty risky move. One thing I have to mention is the sheer hilarity of the fight. Aran Ryan is just hilarious with his insanity and picking fights with people in the crowd, or even throwing the ref out of his way. This guy cares so little for the rules of boxing that in the title defense version of his fight, he actually brings a weapon into the ring. Sure, it's just a boxing glove on a rope, but how many of you want to bet that if there was a third fight with him, he would have brought a gun into the ring? Heck, due to his weapon, he's the only boss in the game where you can't celebrate once you knock him down. He'll try to take a swing at you as he falls over. Before I end this entry though, I'd like to address one thing. Some people wish that Aran Ryan had a goofier appearance, however, I think it really suits him. Know why? Well, considering the appearances of all the other boxers are really crazy and over-exaggerated, it turns out the guy who looks the most normal, aside from Lil Mac obviously, turns out to be the craziest of them all. You know, Saints Row just seems to be a series that gets crazier and crazier as it goes along, and nowhere is that more apparent than Paul.
Paul? You named it Paul? Hey man, does it matter? Shoot them rockets at him already!
Yes, this is a giant energy drink monster. Since the entire level inside of Pierce's mind is essentially gathering weapons and then going to fight Paul, I should talk about the fight. You start off the fight by doing the most logical thing that really anyone would do in this situation, shooting Paul. Then there's a portion of the fight where you have to fire rockets at Paul while a bunch of Saints Flow mascots spawn on your rooftop. Once Paul falls over, Pierce picks you up in a helicopter and you have to fight him off while heading to the other side of the city to execute your plan. Then you go inside the statue of Joe Magarak.
Now the statue has a name? Seriously, you didn't know that. Nobody tells me anything.
Then you control the statue and use it to beat up Paul. And then you get the perfect finisher of this fight, having the statue crack open Paul and then throwing him onto the pedestal where the statue originally was. Overall, this boss fight was awesome because it's a really fun fight and the concept's just so insane you can't help but love it. And I think the developers knew this, seeing as he appears on both the cover of the game and in a later mission. Maybe it's just me, but I love the bosses in Super Mario Galaxy. A lot of them are just so much fun, and to be perfectly honest, from both games, I think the best bosses are the ones that come from Bowser Jr. So which one of them is my favorite? Well, it's a tough call, but I think I'd say my personal favorite is Bowser Jr.'s Boomsday machine. So why is this my personal favorite of them? Well, I honestly think it encompasses all the things that made the other Junior fights really fun. Well, the good ones, that is. It has the sheer scale of Mega Leg, the attack frequency of the airship battle, and the power-up usage of the Mega Hammer. I don't think this fight does those things quite as good as those other fights, but still pretty good. When the fight starts out, you have to use Cloud Mario to get to the top, avoiding the fire bar and the electrical balls until you can ground pound on Junior's cockpit. Second hit, it's the same deal, only sometimes he'll also charge up the Boomsday machine, which will pull all the clouds towards it and electrify the cockpit. However, the third phase of the fight is where it gets real. The Boomsday machine gets up on a pair of tank treads, which almost double it in height and give it the ability to move around. Overall, this fight was intense, and while it was tough to choose the best boss from the Galaxy games, this is a pretty safe bet. You know, Pikmin 3 did a lot to make their bosses bigger and better than the first two games, and my personal favorite is the Vehemoth Phosbat. The Vehemoth Phosbat is an interesting boss, as you don't actually do a whole lot of fighting against it. Basically, what you do throughout the majority of this fight is traverse the dark room looking for bridge pieces to get to other areas, opening up new ways, killing enemies, and avoiding the Vehemoth Phosbat's attacks. That is until you connect the wires with the yellow Pikmin, which turns the lights on and leaves the Vehemoth Phosbat open for an attack. You do this several times throughout the room, just traversing it more and more, as it's very big and confusing, but you eventually make it through it. And at the end, you connect the last wire with all the yellow Pikmin, turning on the biggest light in the room and lighting up the entire room, making it so that the Vehemoth Phosbat can no longer hide from your attacks. Overall, this fight really fit the style of Pikmin, very strategic but very fun as well. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Kingdom Hearts 2 has a great selection of bosses, and my personal favorite one may not be the fan favorite, but I'm still really a big fan of the fight with Luxord. Luxord is the Organization 13 member that controls time, and he also uses cards as his weapons, and he refers to himself as the Gambler of Fate. So, another gambling-themed boss on this list. Funny how that works out. Now, this boss has a lot of gimmicks to it, so you're probably gonna either love or hate it. Seeing as this boss is on the list at all, I think it's safe to assume that I fall into the former category. The first gimmick I think I should talk about are the time bars. You have your regular health in this fight, but you also have 2 time meters at the top, which essentially function like health bars in a fighting game. In this fight, Luxord will hurl giant cards at you, and you can flip them over to eliminate them from existence. As part of Luxord's super attack, he'll spawn a bunch of cards, and you need to get all O's and no X's, or else you could risk being turned into a dice or a card. And he uses a simpler version of that for one of his regular attacks. Overall, Luxord was a very gimmicky but very fun boss fight. Oh boy, I'm gonna get some hate for this one. Yeah, this is Orochi, the most controversial boss in Okami. A lot of people in the Countdown community tend to hate this guy because you have to fight him 3 times. So please understand that I am only talking about the first fight with him, as it had a really good story and good gameplay. For starters, this guy's been built up since the beginning of the game as sort of the main villain, even though after the fight with him, the game's not even halfway over. Basically, 100 years ago, Orochi had been defeated by Amaterasu and Susanoo's ancestors. However, Susanoo was tired of being compared to his ancestor Nagi, so in order to prove that the legend was false, he went to the moon cave and pulled out the sacred sword that was keeping Orochi dead. However, as you would imagine, the legend was true, and Susanoo only admitted it right before you headed out to the moon cave. However, right before the fight, in a stunning act of heroism, Susanoo shows up ready to take on Orochi. Orochi tries to tempt Susanoo into unleashing darkness upon the world in exchange for some evil powers. However, Susanoo's not dumb enough to fall for that and breaks right through Orochi's shield. Then the fight begins. What you have to do in the first phase of the fight is get 3 of Orochi's heads drunk. When that happens, you have to go to the gazebo on top and destroy it, and if you don't destroy it in time, then you'll have to intoxicate the heads all over again. Or you can just use an exorcism slip L to destroy it in 1 hit. Then the second phase of the fight begins, where you have to get each of Orochi's heads drunk and then destroy them. However, it balances out, because in this phase of the fight it only takes 1 shot of liquor to get him drunk instead of 2. Then you summon the moon to power up Susanoo's sword and get ready to finish off Orochi. Then Susanoo uses the Susanoo-style Blade of Truth, where he goes around cutting off each head, and you help him do so by using Power Slash, just like some points earlier in the game. Then, once 7 out of the 8 heads are destroyed, Susanoo prepares for the finishing blow. However, this time it's a bit different. It turns out, throughout the entire game when you were helping him cut things, he actually knew you were helping him, despite the fact it seemed like he didn't. And this time, he doesn't need your help. He slices Orochi's final head clean in half, and that's the fight. It's a shame no one really seems to appreciate this fight since you have to fight him 3 times. Yes, I will admit, fighting the same exact boss with just more HP and calling it a different boss was an incredibly stupid idea. However, the original fight with him still stands as an excellent boss fight. Hey, come on, you knew at least one boss from my first year countdowns had to make the list. This is probably the most out there boss on this list, as it's not a boss fight at all, but rather a race, but it is done in the same context as a boss fight, so it counts. Raced against Carpaccio is great. This race is rigged beyond belief, as your track has a ton of obstacles on it and Carpaccio doesn't have any, but at the same time he does walk for half of the race. This race utilizes every disguise in the game in order to get past all the traps that Carpaccio has set for you. There is a trick you can use against Carpaccio though. Basically, you use Wario to create blocks that'll block Carpaccio's path and he won't be able to move until the block disappears. And it is literally impossible to beat this fight if you don't use that tactic. But at the same time, you have to know when to use that tactic because you can't actually move when using Wario. An interesting part about this fight is that when you lose the race, there's actually a cutscene that you see before you get the game over screen. I find that interesting since it's the only time in the game where they do that. Well, it kind of makes sense because all the other times you get the game over screen, you died. When I was younger, I used to absolutely despise this boss. But after I played it some more when I got better at the game, it's a lot of fun. One important thing to know about the bosses in Epic Mickey is that they give you a choice as to how to defeat them. Since the game has a karma system, it gives you a choice as to whether or not you want to redeem or defeat the boss. However, the thing is, with most of these fights, depending on which option you choose, it doesn't change the fight that much. However, there is one exception, and that exception is Captain Hook. Oh my god, I love this boss battle. It got number 2 on my list for some very good reasons. The setup itself is awesome. I mean, you're on a pirate ship in the middle of the stormy ocean. Not to mention, both the music and the intro set an epic tone for the battle. Now, since the two methods for beating Hook are very different, I'll talk about the good option first, then the evil option. To take the good guy option, you have to climb all the way to the top of the ship in order to save the sprite at the top that Hook has locked up. You have to use both paint and thinner to navigate your way through some of the best puzzle platforming in the entire game. Meanwhile, Hook will follow you and shoot you with thinner, as well as shooting paint and thinner at different objects to impede your progress. When you free the sprite on top of the mast, it summons Pete Pan and he fights Robot Captain Hook in a fight scene so awesome that it warranted being the first clip in my intro. Yes, this does count as redeeming him, as Pete Pan gets his ability to fly back and Captain Hook gets his fighting spirit back. Plus he doesn't die. But what if you choose to defeat Hook? Well, that's an incredibly different but almost as fun fight. Basically, what you do in this version of the fight is you thin out Hook's barrel and armor and then spin him along the tracks on the ship. You can spin certain wheels on the boat to make the tracks chain. Hook's far from defenseless though. He can shoot both thinner and bombs at you. And would you believe me that there are 2 outcomes to the bad guy version in this fight alone? Because there are. The first outcome is from simply pummeling Hook around enough. He's taken so many hits that he just starts falling apart. The second outcome is from strategically thinking about when you spin Hook around and getting him to activate certain things. Once you've gotten Hook to activate all the switches, you've opened up the path for you to spin him down and make him walk the plank, and get eaten by the robotic alligator. This fight's so awesome that I actually have my own method for getting the full experience. Since I like to take the good option in Epic Mickey, here's what I do. I take the bad guy path. Then once I've beaten him, I turn off the Wii before it can autosave, then I turn it back on and take the good guy path. For the longest time, I thought this fight was going to be number 1. However, last year, I played a game that has a boss fight that's even better. Now, if you've seen my top 9 most hated characters list, you know that I'm not the biggest fan of Bertrand. But if there's one thing I have to give credit to the developers for, was just how good they were at making Bertrand hateable. They managed to keep introducing new things that made him more and more despicable. However, the developers did it in such a way that it makes you less angry and more so satisfied whenever you make a move against this guy. Now, any of you who've played this game have pretty much already figured out what boss I'm talking about, but there's something else I'd like to talk about before I continue. Right before the fight with the Behemoth, you see the giant explosion, and you probably thought what I thought when I saw it. Wait, the beast is here? I thought I had more time than that! And lo and behold, it turns out that monster was actually Bertrand. So you kinda know what you're gonna get when you corner Bertrand. It starts off with a bit of dialogue between Bertrand and Cole. Cole has some pretty good lines, but mainly it just serves to hammer in the final nail of how much of a monster Bertrand really is. So it's pretty well done that way. When you're at the peak of your hatred for Bertrand, it's when you're about to kill him. And then the fight starts. And unlike a certain character who's far more widely hated than Bertrand, the fight with him is actually really satisfying. It starts off in Zeke's pickup truck as he takes you to the battlefield, and you have to fend off Bertrand's attacks to keep him from destroying the truck. Also, I love how LaRoche points out that Bertrand's destroying the gasworks and that's where all his money is. Then you make it to the battlefield and Bertrand gets stunned by Zeke's anti-swamp creature lights. The method for beating this guy is very simple, you just have to wait for him to reveal his glowing purple weak points and then attack him. But that's not all, you also have to fend off all the swamp creatures that Bertrand spews at you. You're not alone in this fight though. Nyx, Quo, and a lot of the Resistance members are helping you fight Bertrand. Once you have Bertrand down to half health, in a scene that looks like it was ripped straight out of an action movie, Cole jumps onto the side of a helicopter that's being piloted by one of the Resistance members. Once you're on the helicopter, you have to fend off Bertrand's attacks while you lead him past some turrets that Zeke and LaRoche have set up. However, some of the rockets don't go off, so you have to shoot them while they're stuck inside Bertrand's shell. Then you get back to the battlefield and do the same thing you did the first time you were at the battlefield to kill Bertrand once and for all. And when you finally kill Bertrand, it's so satisfying. Not just because you killed one of the most hateable characters in video game history, but because of the fact that literally everyone agrees that that was the right thing for you to do, which in a karma-based game like Infamous is pretty rare. Heck, after the fight, regardless of your karmic affiliation, LaRoche will call you up and thank you for what you did and tell you that you've been an inspiration. I'm Defoffalizer, and while from a pure gameplay standpoint the fight with Captain Hook was better, from a both gameplay and story point of view, the fight with Bertrand really is the best.